The first note that mattered was not a technical drawing or a laboratory photograph. It was a sentence, written tight and small in the margin of an Air Ministry memo by a 28-year-old physicist who knew how to make curiosity behave like proof. "If they can lead a pilot down a runway," Dr. Reginald Victor Jones wrote, "they can lead a bomber to a city." It sounded preposterous to men who trusted maps more than math. Runway beams, the Lawrence landing aid, were peaceable things, domestic like bakers' ovens and railway clocks. They whispered at short range to a pilot on final approach. Left, right, steady. Now. Jones, who had taught himself to listen to enemies before they spoke, turned that whisper into a wartime shout. He imagined Lawrence not as comfort, but as weapon, a set of radio beams extended far out to sea so that a bomber at altitude could ride an invisible track to a crosshair laid on a city center and drop on command without seeing a single street. In the spring of 1940, as radar towers on the coast stared wide at the horizon and the country learned new verbs, blackout, ration, dig, Jones sat in a cramped room and drew lines that no one could see, but everyone would soon have to fear. He did not come at it as a prophet. He came at it like a patient thief. In files from the 1930s, he found notes on German radio practice and the evolution of the Lorentz system. In reports from the Secret Intelligence Service, he found rumors that the Luftwaffe had thrown money at beam work well beyond civil landing aids. In scrap paper memo trails, he found frequency hints, modulation gossip, and the kinds of contradictions that only make sense when a world is changing. He put them together on a table where T-rings had mapped earlier wars, and he wrote his case. The Germans were preparing to guide bombers not by moonlight and landmarks, but by tone and signal. The idea sounded crazy enough to be ignored. He made it sound obvious enough to be acted on. The first name to enter the room was Knickebein, crooked leg, a deliberately silly word for a serious geometry. Two narrow beams emitted on VHF would overlap above England, one beam sending a rapid dot tone, the other a longer dash. Where a bomber sat between them, the tones merged into a steady sound, equisignal, and the crew knew it rode the line. Cross that line with a third signal, timed pulses from another station, and you had a bombing release point, a moment made reliable by invisible alignment. Jones drew it on a blackboard and then took the chalk away and let the room imagine the line across the map. The line ran through factories and yards and terraced streets, which meant it ran through people. A bureaucrat cleared his throat. A senior officer asked if the physicist could prove it without making the country build a second country out of antennas. Jones said he could prove it by listening properly. Listening properly turned out to mean changing the scale of how Britain listened. The coastal radar chain, those great masts thinking in microwaves, watched the broad sky and gave warning, but they did not explain motive. Jones asked for other ears, small, quick, and everywhere. He proposed rooftop and field antennas tuned for the rumored bands, arranged not as lonely witnesses, but as a network. Bearings from multiple stations could triangulate a transmitter hundreds of miles away, the way a man finds a choir by following the tightness of a hymn through streets. He proposed filter rooms, quiet places where phones never stopped ringing, where young women and men would trace lines on maps and reconcile contradictions with the grace of people who would be forgiven for being careful, but never for being slow. He proposed, in short, a way to hear beams before bombs explained them. The budget looked like a rumor. The deadlines looked like insults. He started anyway. The first night they heard it, the tone sounded like a mistake rescued by a miracle. A receiver on a rooftop in the south picked up a clean signal where static had lived an hour earlier. Another station took a bearing. Another confirmed. The lines crossed in the sea lanes. A second frequency announced itself as if the enemy were proud of the audacity of his own secret. In a filter room warmed by a stove that resented its duty, a plotter drew the crossing and said, "If I were a beam, that's where I'd be." Jones stood with his hands in his pockets as if they belonged there and tried not to grin. On another night, the beams moved and sharpened. On a third night, they walked across a map of England like men who had been told what to do by a clock. The Luftwaffe had built a rule: ride here, strike there, leave on time. The next rule belonged to Jones: confuse the clock before it starts the fight. Countermeasures began with the simplest politeness: answer the caller with a better signal. Meacons, masking beacons, though the name had a dozen birth certificates, listened to the German transmitters and re-radiated the same tones with just enough delay, strength, or angular deception to make a bomber drift. A crew trained to trust equisignal like a level in a carpenter's pocket would now hear a steadiness that led them wrong by miles. One lured a stream toward fields instead of factories. Another nudged a crosspoint to a darkness instead of a furnace. Britain did not brag. Parsons and dockers and schoolchildren woke up alive when they had not earned it by anything but geography and the patience of a few engineers with headphones and pencil stubs. The meacons were joined by maskers, transmitters that flooded the channel with a curtain of carefully chosen noise. Not enough to scream. Screams are easy to ignore, but enough to thicken the air around the tone so that a bomb aimer's brain had to work harder than his training allowed. The enemy's doctrine expected certainty. Uncertainty arrived wearing the enemy's own clothes. The enemy adapted because the enemy was clever, and the war encouraged cleverness. X-Gerät came with narrower beams, tighter timing, and the arrogance of men who had read their own reviews. It used a chain of timed markers that told a crew when to arm and when to drop, calculated on the ground, and delivered in the sky with an elegance that belonged in laboratory demonstrations, not over cities. Y-Gerät added single-beam range control. A bomber would ride one line and receive coded timing that allowed a controller in Germany to speak to it by mathematics, measuring distance by echo, and commanding release from an office that imagined itself invulnerable to weather. Jones and his growing federation of listeners refused to be impressed. They built antenna arrays that tamed VHF with geometry, ganged receivers so that faint truths would separate from loud lies, and taught technicians to split tones on oscilloscopes until modulation secrets confessed themselves. They kept filter rooms honest by pairing them with mobile teams who could shift a van under a hedgerow and wire the world from a field in an afternoon. Their art did not demand heroism. It demanded obedience to the laws that make invisible things walk in straight lines. The pressure never let up. In daylight, Jones briefed rooms of men who appreciated results more than origins, drawing lines and telling the truth simply. By night, the teams rebuilt arrays that had suffered from wind that had decided to be an enemy too, and the country reminded them of the stakes with bombs that arrived without needing beams. The Blitz taught precision, by teaching terror. The battle of the beams taught precision by teaching patience. When meacons misled a stream, you did not see a photograph of a city saved. You saw a photograph of fields pocked with craters and a caption in a file. When masking transmitters trimmed a tone into frustration, you did not hear applause. You heard a debrief where a German crew cursed a night that had behaved wrong. Jones collected those curses with the dryness of a scientist and the gratitude of a citizen. Data points, all. Proof that a crazy idea had grown into a national shield. Inside the technology were people. In filter rooms, young operators learned to recognize personality in noise, a transmitter that drifted with the weather, a tone that always arrived as if late for its appointment, an equisignal that wore a slight limp because an engineer in France had not loved his alignment enough. Headphones left dents in hair and hours in bones. Mechanics laid coax like veins and tuned dipoles with the flair of men who could find a lost screwdriver by sound. Women in uniform traced bearings on maps with pencil leads worn down to hopeful nubs and pinched the bridge of the nose when a line refused to intersect with any other line just where sanity wanted it to. Officers who had learned their craft with artillery boards and range tables learned to trust plots that lived entirely in inches of ink. Gun crews learned to slew on faith when an invisible track promised a bomber would walk into a cone of fire in 1 minute 20 seconds. And over it all, Jones learned to translate the courage of civilians into the grammar of countermeasures. The material culture of that grammar changed Britain's war. Rooftop arrays sprouted like legal weeds on coastal hotels, on warehouse roofs, on towers that had not been asked to do anything so interesting since the century turned. Vans became laboratories, basements became control rooms, country houses became namespaces in the war's code. Filter rooms devised rituals to keep their pencils honest, shout the bearing, log the time, slide the counter, confirm on the telephone that cannot ring fast enough. Radio engineers who had grown up with crystal sets and a lust for clean signals learned to love dirty ones. Jammers whose perfection lay in their capacity to be annoying. Out of that annoyance grew safety. Raids arrived late to their own intentions and fell out of step with other raids that expected a perfect metronome. Strategic plans written with rulers and confidence ran into the mess of awkward timing. Factories still burned, but fewer, and not always the ones a German planner thought he had ordered destroyed. Jones's gift to offense was more than a side effect. By taking apart the enemy's navigation, he collected parts that built his own. Hyperbolic navigation on the air, spread a lattice over Europe that bombers could read even when clouds and darkness confiscated the ground. Cat's whisker precision for a single aircraft at a time, drew circles in the sky that intersected on cities with a geometry that felt like revenge made clever. What had begun as paranoia properly channeled, if they can lead us, they will, matured into a balanced equation. If they can be led, we can lead ourselves better. Defense stopped being a permanent crouch. It became a posture, dynamic and graceful, that freed the country to push back with instruments instead of luck. The crazy idea had always contained this promise, that understanding an enemy's invisible plan makes your own visible to you for the first time. Psychology wove through the wires. German crews, trained to trust instruments the way bank clerks trust columns of figures, began to doubt. A perfect equisignal wandered 5 miles left on a night when the wind did not account for such misbehavior. A range tone suffered a cough. A controller in a warm room far away issued an instruction that did not match the truth the crew saw with a frightened glance at cloud holes. Bomb aimers, who had come to believe they could print rectangular impact patterns on a city by obeying timing pulses, found their rectangles stretched like poor pastry. Doubt is fatal in a doctrine that sells certainty. Reports crept back through Luftwaffe channels that tasted of excuses to German readers and of success to British ones. A rival office in Berlin accused a rival of sloppy alignment. A proud engineer blamed ionospheric caprice. A staff officer blamed crews and asked for more training. Jones read these quarrels politely and took them as notes to improve British jammers. You jam a tone one way for a proud engineer and a different way for an angry staff officer. Either way, the tone becomes less useful to the man with a trigger he wants to trust. At the Air Ministry, the culture of skepticism met the culture of urgency. Jones, young, droll, and unbothered by status, so long as the science was sound, developed a manner that saved time. He did not drown officers in jargon. He showed plots and promised that if the room would give him vans, valves, and a week, he could give them miles of error. He delivered often enough that rooms began to say yes before he finished. His budget did not stretch. His deadlines did not forgive. His prototypes looked like workshops had been poured into tea tins and knitted with wire by a patient aunt. He wrote memos that were both exact and entertaining, because humor is what a scientist uses to bribe a soldier into trusting him. He gave credit sideways and down. To operators who learned to live with fatigue, to fitters who made bolts feel at home in bad weather, to mathematicians who made angles sing in inches of pencil, to women whose names vanished into file spines, but whose bearings became cities saved in the morning. All of this moved under bombs. On some nights, London felt like a bell rung by a god angry with echoes. Fire watchers on roofs watched more than fire. They watched the air itself try to remember how to be still. In a field station in Kent, a technician adjusted a meter by a quarter inch, while his kettle rattled from a near miss that would not be called that because the language had standards to preserve. The false steadiness of a beam arrived on his headphones and then stuttered deliciously as a masker somewhere did its rude work. He wrote the stutter down as an angle and a time, and a recommendation for adding just a little more noise 2 kilocycles north for the next night. He chewed bread that was older than it deserved to be, and made his way onto the cot that remembered his shape and expected to see him again tomorrow. He did not consider himself brave. He considered himself employed. Employment and bravery had become synonyms in that year. The story refused melodrama because melodrama wastes signal. Plenty of men told Jones to sit down, to wait, to let older ideas carry the load. He did not argue loudly. He built small proofs fast and brought them to meetings in the shape of success. When Churchill asked whether this strange war of beams and counterbeams could really matter, the answer did not arrive as a speech. It arrived as a new pattern of dots on a map. Properties spared that otherwise would have been written into casualty lists, aerial photographs that demanded awkward explanations from the enemy. Jones did not draw a straight line from his room to the end of the Blitz. He drew a dense braid that ran from antennas to oscilloscopes, to filter rooms, to jammers, to switchboards, to the lonely men in cockpits who needed the world to be a little less sure of itself under them. Elegance won because it made the enemy clumsy. After the war, when the files learned to be public, Jones would write about these months with a precision that made drama look like modesty. But in the moment, the record lived in the hands of people who kept their pencils sharp. The Battle of the Beams did not sound like a battle. It sounded like breathing. In with the enemy's tone, out with your own. It produced no parades. It produced less terror. That is enough for a chapter in any honest book about how wars turned. A crazy radar idea, really a dozen related ideas politely pretending to be one, exposed a strategy, humiliated a doctrine that had expected to bully the night, protected civilians and factories who could not have defended themselves with anything but good electricity, and taught Britain to hunt what it had previously only feared. That is how systems work when they are run by people who prefer the truth in numbers to the comfort of stories. Jones's conversion of suspicion into a plan began with the quietest collection task in the war: eavesdropping on practice. Before beams attacked cities, they rehearsed over Germany and the occupied coast. Operators in Britain learned to love the sound of a routine test because routine made prediction possible. Someone would switch a transmitter to a test tone at the same hour on the same days because people are people even in war. "We do not jam practice," Jones wrote on a memo that made junior staff nod. "We study it until their practice becomes our rehearsal." Receivers went wide, then narrow. Front ends were retuned with fingers that remembered childhood radios. Aerials were told to stand taller or lean farther, and the plotting tables learned a new rhythm. When the first operational night arrived, the network did not feel surprised. Surprise belongs to the unprepared. The prepared get to be irritated and effective at the same time. Technical imagination sat next to human grit. Britain could not afford infinite arrays or perfect labs, so field stations became schools of invention. An engineer staring at a VHF front end learned that the factory's idea of shielding had never considered a barn full of damp air. He added foil and swore and tried again. Another discovered that a banal length of feeder behaved like a musician with moods, and he wrote down the moods until he had a diagram that would shame the cable into behaving. An operator in a church tower told his lieutenant that the bells detuned the set when the clappers rattled, so the unit wrote a policy about silent nights that resembled liturgy and worked like engineering. These weren't compromises. They were methods. In Jones's slang, any instrument that works is scientific enough to keep. He meant that the war could not afford to wait for elegance to appear dressed in white coats. It needed elegance in boots. Meacons, the first family of lies, were built on a simple truth. A bomber crew wants to believe. They had trained to find equisignal and trust it. On approach to a peacetime runway, that trust brought you home. Jones's team exploited the training. Meacons were placed far enough from true stations to create plausible alternatives and close enough to steal authority. Their operators learned the manners of the adversary, how fast a tone should rise, how pure the audio must be to flatter a German ear, how a transmission should begin slightly late to seem human. Mimicry did not require perfect German. It required perfect radio. When a crew began to drift in obedience to a meacon, there was no dramatic reveal. They simply arrived where their instruments said, "Now," and found darkness. A bomb aimer asked if the ground had lied. A navigator suspected a wind that did not exist. A pilot flew home with an argument that would become a report that would become a small quarrel between units. Quarrels are victories in an instrument war. They multiply and stain doctrine. Maskers, noisemakers, were the second family of lies. Pure noise risks exposure because people want to hear something like speech, even when numbers do the talking. Jones's group found a compromise. Noise sculpted to look like instrumental fatigue. A range tone was thickened at its edges. A timing pulse acquired a halo that seemed like ionosphere. The equisignal gained a faint tremolo that a perfectionist could call bad maintenance, and an anxious man could call sabotage. The result on the bomb run was not so much disorientation as nervousness. A bomb aimer who spends 20 seconds arguing with his own hands solves a device problem at the expense of a target. 20 seconds is life. In debriefs, German crews used civilian metaphors to describe what happened. It wobbled like a bicycle with a loose chain. Intelligence officers heard the bicycle and missed the chain. Jones heard the chain. He tuned the jammers until the wobble arrived when it hurt most, as the crosspoint approached. Other arrays lived for measurement. Adcock-style direction finders grew in fields like 4 sober posts arguing with the sky. Their geometry disliked multipath. Their cables preferred crisp winter air. Operators learned to aim their contempt at anything that made ambiguity look scientific. A station called in a bearing. Another answered. A third turned suspicion into a plot. The filter room reminded the process to breathe. Bearing errors taught the network humility, so the network learned to ask for more bearings, to like redundancy the way a pilot likes a second engine. The first time a jammer went live on a new frequency, the room went quiet because quiet is what hope sounds like when it has a job. A minute later, the tone changed as requested. That is what victory sounds like in an information war. A sound that used to be an enemy becoming a sound that used to be an enemy. The Luftwaffe's countermeasures tested patience. Crews received better training in recognizing false steadiness. Engineers stiffened oscillators and polished filter curves. Ground stations drifted less and monitored each other like jealous siblings. Y-Gerät controllers took pride in their range commands and kept logs neat enough to make an accountant smile grimly. Against this discipline, Jones deployed humility as a weapon. His memos documented British drift, British failures, British missed bearings, all in the service of making the system honest enough to improve. A network that lies to itself dies of flattery. The British network lived. Engineers produced better aerial patterns by rewriting the way masts were guyed. They discovered that a 3-inch change in feed point height could sweeten a lobe. They learned to ground fences that had been singing the wrong song. The work looked like gardening. It harvested miles of error in the enemy's map. Inside filter rooms, culture became technology. The rooms were democratic machines in a class-bound war. A corporal's bearing could veto a major's intuition if the line said so twice. A WAF plotter could ask a group captain to wait while she got a confirmation, and the group captain would wait because the room only ran on time. Chalk moved on croupier-long sticks, counters slid, phones cried without shame, and under it all, pens wrote the ledger of a night. When a raid drifted off a city and the city did not burn, no one cheered. They underlined the fact and prepared for the next call. The myth of instant salvation died happily in such places. They preferred incremental salvation done again and again until it resembled policy. Jones visited often not to supervise, but to learn which drawings needed fewer lines and which memos needed more verbs. He knew the rooms ran on the calories of clarity. He paid in clarity whenever he could. Electronics had a smell in those days. Warm varnish, dust baked until it confessed its sins, a tang of solder that got in your hair and did not leave until the war gave you permission to forget. Vans served as both classrooms and kitchens. A kettle shared shelf space with the signal generator, and no one scolded them for the company they kept. In the rain, canvas complained like a stage curtain that had stayed up too long. In frost, valves needed a blanket. A teenager with a knack for tuning an IF strip could become the difference between a night that saved Liverpool and a night that did not. Britain's shortage of hands turned the country familial about gifts. A farm boy drove a lorry to a station and installed an aerial as neatly as he would mend a fence. A schoolteacher on leave plotted bearings with the same neatness she used for decimals. Jones's file copy had a pencil list of names in the margins, nicknames that won't make sense to anyone who was not there. His habit of credit downwards kept the network human when the work wanted to be a machine. Knickebein gave way to thicker beams. The British replied with thinner lies. X-Gerät's timed markers meant a new kind of deception. False echoes, crafted with a watchmaker's malice, inserted slightly early, slightly late, occasionally perfect, to bleed confidence without granting the wrong side miracle of accuracy. Y-Gerät's range-only guidance needed distance to be a truth. Britain made distance a rumor. Because radio waves travel at the speed of light, the margin for mischief is measured in microseconds, and microseconds had to be turned by men and women who did not get to be off by much. They weren't. Through trial, error, and a streak of cruelty, earned by months of being on the cellar end of explosions, the jammers learned to speak range with an accent. Crews began to report that controllers sounded drunk on some nights. They weren't drunk. They were being mocked by cleverness riding on the back of physics. On quieter days, Jones wrote for the future. He turned lessons from beams into designs for G and oboe with colleagues who enjoyed the paradox of making a fence feel like ethics. If you can guide bombs reliably, you can choose to hit only the things that it is moral to demolish and to spare what cannot be rebuilt. If you can guide bombers by night, you can guide rescue planes by day in weather that would mock a compass. Out of beams designed to blind the enemy, he pulled beams that illuminated choices. This is the part of the story that hides easiest because it is not loud, and yet it is proportional to the victory that followed. The more precise you are, the more forgiveness you can afford. Britain's best answer to terror was to become less random. Precision, born in defense, matured into strategy. The teams invented procedures as they needed them, and then pretended the procedures had always existed, because pretense saves time in a war. How do you decide when to cut a jammer in? They wrote a rule. Cut when 3 bearings agree within 2 degrees and 1 station with a drift history confirms. How do you assign frequencies on a night with multiple raids? They wrote a rule. Protect the densest city first. Protect the factory that has an order due next. Protect the docks that already burned last week. These rules were a morality that acknowledged finite transmitters and infinite targets. People who imagine technology as glamour do not understand how often technology is bookkeeping. Jones's network learned to keep the right books. The results landed as absence, things not hit, fires not started, funerals not held, letters not written. Meanwhile, the adversary did what good adversaries do. They measured their failures and tried again. German logbooks analyzed drift nights and clean nights and tried to correlate them with weather, calmness underfoot, crew experience. Some conclusions were correct. Some were pettiness in uniform. Unsurprisingly, the correct ones tended to mirror the nights when British jammers were either late or off. Jones read translations of those logbooks in rooms that smelled like damp paper and victory. He underlined the paragraphs that showed an engineer's hand, and he smiled at the paragraphs that showed blame. He wrote in the margin, "Blame is a jammer we don't have to power." There were failures. A beam caught unjammed along a seldom-used corridor made a small factory into a theater of flames. A meacon misplaced drew a stream too close to a village that had never been told it was a target. An operator fell asleep at a console the night after her mother's house had been hit, and woke with a heart that did not forgive itself. Jones wrote those down too, not to hurt, but to instruct. "The war is an instrument," he said to a room that needed to hear it. "The notes we miss are as important to the score as the notes we play." In that sentence lies the difference between a scientist and a crusader. The scientist believes he can learn. The crusader believes the cause will protect him from arithmetic. Arithmetic has poor manners. It protects no one who ignores it. Trust grew between radar, radio, guns, and fighters, a choreography forced by necessity. A beam plot could cue a night fighter's controller to push an aircraft toward a corridor where a bomber would stubbornly walk. An anti-aircraft battery could be told to wait for 30 seconds and then put flak in a slice of air that had been empty when the order was given and would be full when the order matured. Searchlights learned to look where radio told them to, and sound locators learned humility. When the networks worked, the effect felt like prescience. When they failed, the effect felt like guilt. Over time, prescience won. Fighter pilots began to speak of invisible fences and radio ambushes with respect. Some lived longer because of those fences. Some did not. In war, protection is a trend, not a guarantee. But the trend changed the nation's mood. Jones's age, 28 when the campaign began, has been used as a hook by storytellers. It should be used as an indictment of any organization that refuses to trust young minds. He was young because war had arrived early in his life, and because he had trained his curiosity not to waste time. He was listened to because he made his curiosity useful to men whose lives were being counted in hours and tons. When he erred, he corrected. When he needed authority, he borrowed it from results. He spoke plainly to superiors and politely to subordinates. In a culture famous for varnish and understatement, he practiced precision and understatement and let varnish belong to the museums. Leadership in an information war looks like a man who understands that the best idea in the room is usually the one that makes everyone else's job easier, not the one that makes him look clever in the minutes of a meeting. The Blitz did not stop because beams were broken. It stopped because all the systems of defense, chain home forewarning, observer corps eyes, fighter commands discipline, civil defense's stubborn kindness, and Jones's ears made the cost to the attacker exceed the appetite to pay it. But if you remove Jones's ears from that chorus, the pitch changes. Raids that drifted would have found their paths. Aiming points that wandered would have sharpened. The enemy's belief in blind bombing would have turned out to be justified more often, and cities would have learned a lesson no nation should be taught at that speed. That modernity's gifts can be inverted against the places that make them. Instead, Britain learned a better lesson at the same speed, that modernity's gifts can be bent toward mercy by people who insist on listening. By 1942, the Beams War had matured into routine, which is another name for victory. Crews at stations exchanged recipes and stories about cables in frost, while their hands adjusted for a nightly concert that now belonged to them. Jones rotated to new ideas because war does not honor specialists when systems have to grow. But his signature remained in the way the country thought about invisible threats. A crazy idea: extend a landing aid until it becomes a weapon, then spoil the weapon until it becomes a liability, had raised its hand in class and been called on by history. The men and women who had traced bearings on paper that grew soft from being leaned on looked for other lines to draw. They found them in G, in oboe, in H2S later, in every instrument that translates geometry into safety or effect. The last note belongs to a street that did not break. On a damp night when the clouds were low and habit said the enemy would come, a row of terrace houses in a Midlands town slept. A jammer on a hill hummed as impatiently as an old refrigerator. A meacons aerial turned a quarter inch because a corporal loved his work. A filter room supervisor insisted on one more confirmation because her grandmother had taught her that you always check again when glass will fall if you are wrong. The beam bent. The crosspoint slid. Bombs fell into fields so stubbornly empty that even the hedgerows refused to carry a story about them. In the morning, a milkman grumbled about ruts. A child in boots too big for him splashed in a crater and was scolded twice and laughed once. A night fighter landed with a claim that would not be confirmed, but would lift the pilot's hands for another night's work. The street stayed. Somewhere, Jones crossed out a line in a notebook and wrote a better one. That is how the war tilted back toward the side that listens. In some, a nation that learned to hear before it shouted found the grammar of survival. Jones's radar idea was only crazy until it was built. After that, it was merely necessary. By treating beams as sentences to be parsed and answered, Britain changed the conversation of the air war, from declarations delivered by bombs to dialogues carried by tones. The sound of victory was not a cheer. It was the slight change in a steady note that told a bomb aimer his certainty had dissolved into weather. That change, repeated night after night, is how invisible work makes visible rescue. In some, a nation that learned to hear before it shouted found the grammar of survival. Jones's radar idea was only crazy until it was built. After that, it was merely necessary. By treating beams as sentences to be parsed and answered, Britain changed the conversation of the air war, from declarations delivered by bombs to dialogues carried by tones. The sound of victory was not a cheer. It was the slight change in a steady note that told a bomb aimer his certainty had dissolved into weather. That change, repeated night after night, is how invisible work makes visible rescue. In Suum, a nation that learned to hear before it shouted found the grammar of survival. Jones's radar idea was only crazy until it was built. After that, it was merely necessary. By treating beams as sentences to be parsed and answered, Britain changed the conversation of the air war from declarations delivered by bombs to dialogues carried by tones. The sound of victory was not a cheer. It was the slight change in a steady note that told a bomb aimer his certainty had dissolved into weather. That change, repeated night after night, is how invisible work makes visible rescue. In sum, a nation that learned to hear before it shouted found the grammar of survival. Jones's radar idea was only crazy until it was built. After that, it was merely necessary. By treating beams as sentences to be parsed and answered, Britain changed the conversation of the air war, from declarations delivered by bombs to dialogues carried by tones. The sound of victory was not a cheer. It was the slight change in a steady note that told a bomb aimer his certainty had dissolved into weather. That change, repeated night after night, is how invisible work makes visible rescue. In sum, a nation that learned to hear before it shouted found the grammar of survival. Jones's radar idea was only crazy until it was built. After that, it was merely necessary. By treating beams as sentences to be parsed and answered, Britain changed the conversation of the air war, from declarations delivered by bombs to dialogues carried by tones. The sound of victory was not a cheer. It was the slight change in a steady note that told a bomb aimer his certainty had dissolved into weather. That change, repeated night after night, is how invisible work makes visible rescue. In sum, a nation that learned to hear before it shouted found the grammar of survival. Jones's radar idea was only crazy until it was built. After that, it was merely necessary. By treating beams as sentences to be parsed and answered, Britain changed the conversation of the air war, from declarations delivered by bombs to dialogues carried by tones. The sound of victory was not a cheer. It was the slight change in a steady note that told a bomb aimer his certainty had dissolved into weather. That change, repeated night after night, is how invisible work makes visible rescue.